I love old school strategy guides. Back when video games were still new, it was significantly more difficult to find information on a new game. That's where books like these came in handy. The Prima's official strategy guides for Starcraft. They gave you detailed information about anything in the game, but for me, the most fun thing in these books was the campaign mission guides. From detailed maps to in-depth strategies on how to complete the missions, these were very nice for a new player like myself. So, I decided to take a trip down memory lane and see how well these books held up. The rules to the run are simple. Follow the guide as closely as possible, and if anything isn't explicitly stated for a particular mission, use a tactic taken from previous mission. This will mostly matter with resource management. That's it. Let's hop into this run. Disclaimer, this is the second part of this story. I played through the first 3 campaigns in the video linked in the description. This time, we are starting with the Protoss Campaign, and with Mission 1, Escape from Ire, being one of my personal favorite campaign missions, the book tells us to be aggressive with our strategy, pushing forward fast and aggressively so that we can take out enemy forces before losing many of our own, which overall the strategy does work. However, due to a specific point in the book where it tells me instead of actually fighting the fight to go around and try and take out the Nidus canals, I end up actually taking a ton of damage and have to reset. However, on a following attempt, I end up just kind of ignoring this little tidbit of information, and while I still technically send Zeratul around, I just don't send my entire forces around to try and take out the canal. Overall, though, the strategy is fairly simple, just pushing forward aggressively and quickly moving through various different enemies. Finally, we end up meeting up with more reinforcements, notably the High Templar, and utilizing High Templar to storm our way through the rest of the enemies. Once we make it up this ridge, it's game over. Mission 2, Dunes of Shakuris, is a pretty simple macro mission, forcing us to build up and then push out into the enemy forces and remove them from the map. Again, a fairly simple concept. And the strategy overall is one that we will see time and time again with these macro missions. Build up a defense, build up your forces, and then attack the enemy, making sure to expand to wherever the location is that we are able to expand to, and inevitably just overpowering our opponent. Most of the time, they also tell us to make a specific amount of units. For example, in this one, we are told to build 12 Zealots and 12 Dragoons, and a couple Reavers. Overall, though, it works really well and does ultimately get us the victory. However, that's not the only way this book gives to beat this mission. Quote, strategy counterpoint. Blizzard quality assurance analyst John LeGrave has different ideas about which units to use to attack the Zerg base. He suggests Dragoons and Dark Templars. The Dark Templars are invisible to all Zerg units except for Spore Colonies and Overlords. LeGrave sends in Dragoons to take out these detector units so the Dark Templar can rip Zerg structures to shreds unseen. Unquote. What's interesting about this is the only time the book gives us a straight-up alternate strategy from some of the other team members working at Blizzard. I find this very endearing and honestly a pretty solid strategy, surprisingly. On Mission 3, Legacy of the Xel'Naga, we end up getting a force of Corsairs and Dragoons dropped onto enemy forces, protecting a new base. And the book tells us, quote, there are 2 main resource areas to exploit, and you'll probably have to in this mission, unquote. However, there's only one other resource node to exploit in this mission. Other than your starting base, there's nothing else. I guess unless you want to take out the entire map and then take the resources from the enemy after you've already neutralized them. Maybe that's what it wants to do. Either way, it tells us to climb the tech tree and then, quote, build at least 6 scouts, 4 Corsairs, 5 shuttles, and numerous ground forces, including Reavers, Zealots, Dragoons, and most importantly, Dark Templar. Only Dark Templar can destroy Cerebrits, unquote. And once we do that, we sweep through the enemy bases, quote, remember, only Dark Templars can kill Cerebrits, unquote, and then we win the mission. Mission number 4, the Quest for Uraj, is a pretty cool mission. You start out by taking a base after Reavers and Dragoons are dropped into a Terran base and absolutely neutralize it, and then from that position, move out with your Reavers and your Dragoons to take out the other enemy forces just down the ramp. The book states, quote, start building a balanced force of air and ground units for your attack on the remaining Terran forces, unquote. However, the problem with this is that I can't build air. It literally tells me in the game, Artanis shows up and says, hey, we're having issues, you can't make air units. So I guess we're just making a bunch of shuttles. After that, it states, quote, you can approach this mission with either stealth or with brute force, and then tells us to either pick the path A or path B marked out on the map. I elected to do both Part A and Part B, and honestly, for the most part, they are pretty similar. One just allowing you to run through the enemy forces pretty effectively, utilizing Reavers and what have you, and the other one utilizing Kerrigan to just kind of drop onto the enemy tank and pick up the crystal. Both are pretty simple, both work really well. Mission 5, the Battle of Braxis, is one of the most unique and most fun missions in all of StarCraft Brood War, and quite frankly is my personal favorite mission in all of both StarCraft 1 and StarCraft 2. And why is that? Well, it's a no-build mission that centers around taking down power generators in order to allow more access of the map, given that the entire map is full of missile turrets. With the strategy presented to us, it's pretty simple. It just tells us which way to go for each of the different power generators. After taking down each individual power generator, it gives us a new strat utilizing the new forces given to us. Overall, it's a pretty simple strategy to follow, and it does tell us basically from start to finish how to accomplish each and every mission. Mission 6, Return to Char, is another new addition to the formula that has been presented to us in the past game. And this is another one where we control 2 different factions, utilizing them to take out the Overmind, very similar to that of Eye of the Storm. However, this time, unlike the Terran and Protoss from the previous 2-race mission, we are given the Protoss and the Zerg. And utilizing the Zerg and the Protoss, we are able to clear our way through to the Overmind. The strategy is simply telling us how to take out the Overmind. It doesn't even give us a strategy for trying to go after the Khalas. Once we have established our second base, it tells us to build up a bunch of Zealot, Dragoons, Zerglings, and Hydralisks in equal measure. Then, quote, because the path to your second Zerg base to the Overmind is narrow, move only one group of units through at a time, unquote. We end up pushing through with just a bunch of Zerglings and Hydralisks and what have you, and end up taking out the Overmind. Mission 7, the Insurgent, starts with us being betrayed by Aldaris, one of the High Templar, and he ends up taking a whole bunch of our forces with him. Quote, the key to this mission lies in your Dark Archon's ability to use mind control to capture enemy units, unquote. The interesting thing about this mission is that originally you weren't capable of building capital ships or most anything. You didn't have High Templar, carriers, etc. However, with the remaster, you still have the ability to build carriers. But due to the fact that this strategy was made prior to the remaster, you still actually need the Dark Archons, and the strategy overall centers around utilizing Dark Archons to steal high impact units, and then at the very end, pushing through with these high impact units through one and then the second enemy base, and then just mind controlling Aldaris from there, causing us to win the mission. And then Kerrigan shows up and kills him anyway. Mission 8, Countdown, is the finale to the Protoss Campaign, and once we take the temple, it turns into a timed defense mission. But before we take the temple, it tells us to build up our forces in large number, starting by securing our 2 bases where both Zeratul and Artanis are located, by building many photon cannons as well as a few other units for defense, then inevitably building up a large group of Reavers, Dragoons, and Zealots to secure the temple. Having secured the temple, it tells us to build a nexus around the temple and build a small base, including 1 gateway. Once our defenses are in place, we are then able to bring in both Zeratul and Artanis, start the 15-minute countdown, and then just survive from there. It also tells us that we should sacrifice our probes to get more military units. Before moving on to the next campaign, consider subscribing. I'll be making content like this a lot, and it really helps. And with that, we are on to the Terran Campaign, starting with Mission 1, First Strike, which starts off by having us unable to have any Vespene gas. We literally have none and have to venture out to actually obtain some. It tells us to build up 10 Marines and 2 tanks to move forward and take out the first enemy base. Once we do that, we are then to move into Doran's camp, meet up with Doran, and then obtain the Vespene Geyser. From there, it tells us to build up a small force, including some siege tanks, Marines, as well as some Goliaths, and move up the canyon to where the enemy command center is located and simply take it out. Mission 2, Delarian Shipyards, is very similar to the Battle of Braxis from the previous campaign, except instead of destroying power generators, we are to bring pilots to battlecruisers to steal them from the Dominion. With this information, we are given a pretty simple outline as to how to take on each of the new locations, utilizing the new medics that we are given on this mission, using them to heal, restore, and blind certain units in order to allow each of our forces and the other pilots to occupy more and more battlecruisers. At the very end, it's a pretty simple battlecruiser v battlecruiser fight, and we end up winning the mission. Mission 3, Ruins of Tarsonis, is a really interesting mission. Each one of the enemy Zerg hives has a unique strategy that they employ. The two farthest from us end up utilizing very high power late game units in Guardians, Ultralisks, and Defilers, while the first two utilize more early and mid-game units, such as Mutalisks, Hydralisks, and Zerglings. The book tells us to pretty quickly take out the first two hives, utilizing various different strategies, mostly centering around siege tanks and supporting those siege tanks with Marines. Having taken out the first two Zerg hives, it tells us to push forward into the middle of the map and take the base in the middle, then defend it utilizing the siege tanks and bunkers, and from there push forward on to the next two bases. Utilizing dropships to drop siege tanks to shell the hive from above, we can end up taking out the hive there. However, the problem is Ultralisks. The book states, quote, "The Zerg will attempt to drop Ultralisks on the ridge using their overmines. Keep your Marines ready to shoot the overmines from the sky if they come near," unquote. Two things with this. One, there's a ramp. The Ultralisks just walk up the ramp and attack us anyway, and because of Defilers, we actually can't end up hitting them. And the second thing, it's overlords, not overmines. Just thought that would be funny. Inevitably, after utilizing many a drops and many a siege tanks, we actually do take out this hive. And the last hive is also pretty simple. Utilizing Marines with siege tanks behind, we are able to quickly push through this base, even with the defense of Guardians and Mutalisks. Once done, we move Duran up to the Psi Disruptor, and we win the mission. Mission 4, the Assault on Quarhal, is a mission that actually leads into two different missions, depending on which units you don't want to face on the next mission, whether that be Ghosts and Nukes, or the Battle Cruisers, both of which are fairly annoying to deal with. Having your base get nuked over and over can be very frustrating, and Battle Cruisers force you into utilizing more anti-air. So, the strategy is pretty simple. After building up the tech tree, we are to then move to the middle of the map where this base is located, and from there we can decide whether to go down to take out the nukes, or go up in order to take out the battle cruisers. I ended up doing both to determine which of the strategies was more effective, and which of the next missions was going to be easier. Mission 5 has two different missions. Starting with Mission 5A, Emperor's Fall, Ground Zero, we end up getting our base absolutely nuked by a whole bunch of ghosts. Yeah, turns out we took out the battlecruisers this time. So, with this in mind, we have to deal with ghosts and nukes. So, how does that change the strategy? It doesn't. The strategy remains the same regardless of which mission you do, the only difference being the strategy that you employ when you start the mission. Against the nukes, it tells us to simply rebuild, and against the battlecruisers, it tells us to lock down the battlecruisers and then use Goliaths to take them out. However, the strategy for both dealing with battlecruisers and dealing with ghosts on this mission remains the same, which is to utilize the worst combination of units I've ever had the displeasure of utilizing, which is Marines and siege tanks. Now, the problem with this is that Marines are terrible against everything that Terran has to offer, and the siege tanks are incredibly bulky and difficult to maneuver in such tight corridors. Having to do this mission twice ended up being such a slog due to the fact that Minsk likes to utilize things like tanks all over the place, which are very, very good at shredding through Marines. And so ending up with basically zero Marines all the time makes things like battlecruisers very annoying to deal with. Overall, making it so that the Ghost mission was a little bit easier to do, just due to the fact that the actual strategy seemed to apply more to that one as opposed to the battlecruiser one. Turns out medics with the restoration ability are actually pretty useful against ghosts. Also, side tangent, I hate TVT, don't make me play TVT again. Why is it that every Terran campaign is just full of Terran versus Terran? I hate it. Terrible matchup. Mission 6, Emperor's Flight, is at least a little bit more interesting. Starting off by absolutely nuking the ever-living crap out of these Mutalisks using the new Valkyrie, we then actually get a new base and can start building up our defenses. From here, we are told to push forward into this area in the middle of the map to take a new base, and from here we can actually just secure it with a few siege tanks. Then we are to push up into the Zerg base on Area C up in the top left corner of the map with a bunch of siege tanks and Marine Medic. However, against Zerg, Marine Medic actually does work fairly well, so I'm not too upset with utilizing them here, and with the backup of the siege tanks, it is pretty nice. The big notable thing about this is that it does force us to utilize two very different strategies with the tanks and the Marines, which both require two different sets of upgrades, which means that every mission takes way longer due to the fact that I have to get a whole bunch more upgrades than I normally would. However, this time we are also told to add in another set of units, that being battlecruisers and Valkyries, to push in a two-pronged assault on the Protoss base, inevitably pushing through to the Terran Command Center where Minsk is hiding and destroying it. Mission 7, Patriot's Blood, is another no-build mission. However, unlike some of the previous no-build missions, this one is similar to Starcraft 1's no-build missions, with a few additional triggers and stuff like that, showcasing more of the way that Brood War has improved. However, overall, it's a pretty simple mission. Follow the arrows on the map, picking up additional reinforcements as you go, and unlike some of the previous missions in the first book, this one actually does tell you to pick up all of the additional reinforcements that you can, which is pretty nice. However, from there, we are just to walk through, kill a bunch of Zerg, and activate these turret traps at the very end, and then we win the mission. Mission 8, to Chain the Beast, is one of the most interesting finales in all of StarCraft, at least from a story perspective. In terms of the mission variety, it is still pretty unique, giving us 3 different Cerebrits, all of which utilize a different strategy to haunt us. The first one makes a whole bunch of sunken colonies invulnerable, forcing us to not really engage with them. The second one sends a Torosk that is extremely difficult to deal with and ends up slaughtering us every time it gets respawned, and it gets respawned a bunch. And the third one makes infested Marines. So, you know, it exists. As far as these 3 Cerebrit goes, honestly, all 3 of them require a different strategy, and the book tells us pretty simply how to utilize them. The first one is to just simply attack via air. If you don't want to deal with sunken colonies, don't deal with them. Attack the Cerebrit via air, take it out utilizing battlecruisers and Valkyries, and move on with your day. The second one is also a fairly simple slog through the enemy base to eventually just take out the Cerebrit utilizing things like Marines and siege tanks. And for the last one, it actually gives us 2 different strategies. I elected to go with the dropship one because that seems to be the one that it actually spoke about in the book. Giving us more information about it and utilizing it seemed to be the strategy that it wanted us to go with. So I inevitably dropped a whole bunch of siege tanks and Marines and ended up getting cleaned up. So I did it again and eventually did end up actually taking out the Cerebrit, leaving us with just the Overmind to be stimulated via drugs. Hooray, medics. Now for the final campaign, the Zerg Campaign. Starting with Mission 1, Vile Disruption, this one gives us a very strong set of early units utilizing our Hunter-Killers to move through a bunch of different Zerg bases. However, once we actually reach the base, we are informed that we can't actually do anything with the bases. Then we find out that this is actually a no-build mission and are told to, quote, send your Hunter-Killers to the new location, unquote. Yeah, for some reason we're told just to utilize our Hunter-Killers as opposed to our entire force. Don't know why that's the case with this one. But alas, once we do that, we can then grab up all of our forces and then move on to the next hive. At this point, we are basically just hive jumping from hive to hive, pushing away enemy forces, utilizing the new group of forces that are given to us, like Scourge, Queens, Defilers, etc., until eventually we come across the final base, and it's a big brawl between a whole bunch of different Zerg renegade forces. Mission 2, Reign of Fire, is a pretty cool mission in concept and is executed pretty poorly from the strategy guide. Due to the fact that we start with the side emitter, we are told to pick up the different Zerg forces that are scattered around utilizing this psi emitter to then start building a base. Starting with the drones, then picking up these Zerglings, and then we can find ourselves some Hydralisks. Actually, I lied to you, they're Hunter-Killers. Isn't that fantastic? Not only that, but there's a whole bunch of other elite Zerg units. Notably, the devouring ones behind this bunker, an elite Ultralisk known as the Tarask, the same one that was in the previous campaign, as well as a few hunter-killers, meaning that we have a very durable force of elite units to start the mission. Then we are told to put them in a corner and don't do anything with them. Or more specifically, we're not actually told to utilize these forces, instead utilizing just regular Zerglings and Hydralisks to push through a well-established fortification full of siege tanks, firebats, and the like. This was a slog. It really didn't work. Okay, that's not entirely true, it did work, but for the most part it was frustrating, which was the biggest downside. While the strategy technically would work inevitably, just due to the fact that I have more resources than my opponent, and overall I do have the ability to consistently rebuild and push through, it would have been very nice to actually utilize these elite forces. Mission 3, the Kelmorian Combine, is a mission that is just about getting minerals. Our whole task is to obtain 10,000 minerals. However, it tells us to, quote, although you don't need to infest any of the command centers to win the mission, the more you capture, the better off you'll be in the next mission, unquote. Which, while that is technically true, you will have more buildings overall when you start the next mission, you don't actually need any infested Terran. Infested Terran are pretty useless overall, and are mostly a resource sink as opposed to something that's actually useful. However, with that being said, after we establish our base by taking it from the enemies, we are told, quote, the only land route into the first area is via Area A in the northeast, unquote. This is a lie. There's a ramp right here. Look at Phoenix, dance on the ramp. Why is there a ramp here? Well, that's because you can actually attack from another ramp over here, which is connected to a base as well as an enemy base just right down this ramp, and yes, they attack from here several times. So I don't know why we were told this information, likely due to the fact that the map changed in development or after this map was originally playtested. Also, the book tells us, quote, your task in this mission is to infest the Terran command centers, unquote. Which is just, again, not true. It's to mine 10,000 minerals, and the additional thing that you can do is to add additional command centers to your arsenal. However, what I will say is that at least the strategies presented in the book, as well as the overall gameplay, was interesting. Normally, this mission is a fairly boring slog of just mining 10,000 minerals and then moving on. However, due to the fact that we actually do obtain the infested command centers and are utilizing a wide array of strategies to push through enemy bases, it actually ends up making this mission fairly fun. And while it does take a while to actually obtain all of the resources necessary and to obtain the necessary command centers, it does overall work. One notable thing is that one of the mission's win conditions is to infest all 5 of the different command centers, which was not something I was aware of. Mission 4, the Liberation of Korhal, is one of my favorite missions. It utilizes the Swarm to its best advantage, utilizing things like Zerglings, Hydralisks, and Ultralisks in large amounts to push through enemy fortifications. And the book tells us to do a bunch of similar things, utilizing our starting forces to push into the top base that's right up here in order to start getting even more resources, notably Vespene. And from there, just utilizing all of our resources that we currently have due to the previous mission in order to start aggressively pushing through enemy fortifications, utilizing things like Zerglings, Hydralisks, Ultralisks, Mutalisks, and Guardians to push into very established fortifications on Korhal. From there, we can easily sweep through pretty much the entire map, utilizing the same strategies each and every time to push through, establish a base, push through, establish a base, and then inevitably push through to the final Terran UED defenses and break Korhal. One of the strategies that it tells us to do is something that I've been doing up until this point already, but it actually tells us to set our rally point outside where we want to attack so that our forces do not have to travel nearly as far once we've actually made them. This is a very simple strategy, but it's also something that's very important for just general gameplay, allowing us to actually move more efficiently through space. Very nice, and a very nice addition to the strategies presented to us in this book. Mission 5, True Colors, is a Blizzard staple. Pretty much every single one of their campaigns has some sort of True Colors-esque mission, and this, if I'm not mistaken, is the first. True Colors allows us to basically do a sneak attack mission, forcing our opponents into a helpless state and utilizing the forces that we have to crush whatever they have before they inevitably counterattack us. The book tells us to start by taking out the Terran forces, utilizing the established forces that we have already to push through the first 2 enemy bases bases on the left Terran side, and from there we can then establish 2 of our own bases. After having established our own bases, it tells us to prepare for the counterattack utilizing things like our sunken colonies and spore colonies and other such defenses. After having established our forces on these bridges as well as defending our base from the counterattack, we are then to deal a significant amount of damage to the Protoss forces by taking out the first and second of their bases. From that position, we are then to push into each one of the enemy bases as we see fit. Having established the mass control of the map, we can then just push over each one of these bridges in order to then finish off the enemy bases. And having finished off the enemy bases, we then can take out both Duke and Phoenix. And yes, you can just broodling Phoenix with a queen to just immediately end the fight, but alas, I elected to actually give him an honorable fight like he deserves. One thing of note is that it actually tells us to utilize Zerglings against Reavers. It says, quote, "Another way to defeat the Reaver is to make them waste their shots on your Zerglings. If you build up enough Zerglings, you can rush the bridge non-stop until the Reaver is destroyed." Unquote. Which is a ridiculous strategy that I really enjoyed utilizing, because it didn't work in any capacity, but it was funny. Mission 6, Fury of the Swarm, kind of feels like filler. When you've ever watched an anime or just any TV show and you see that the plot has stalled for one of the episodes, that's kind of what this mission feels like. Fury of the Swarm starts by giving us a whole bunch of different outposts that inevitably get attacked by Zerg forces. The book tells us to not even try to save any of these, and in fact just build up our forces on our starting island. The book tells us to get both the transport and movement speed upgrades for our overlords so that we can actually start an assault on the enemy base, which it tells us to do pretty quickly so that we can actually establish more resources and get another foothold on the main island. From this position, we can then actually start building up additional forces, and I am actually lying to you. This actually took several attempts for me to establish this base, because the first attempt, even with the forces provided in the book, just didn't work. I had to do it again, and then it eventually did work. But yeah, overall, we did end up taking out these 2 bases, establishing our own bases in these footholds, and from there, just building up a strong, powerful force to push through both the Zerg base that is on this map as well, and then pushing through to the Terran base. Once all of the scientists are cleaned up, we can end the mission. Mission 7, the Drawing of the Web, is a rather interesting mission, conceptually. However, in execution, it ends up being a pretty simple objective. Bring Terran to a bunch of different beacons, and that's pretty much it. In fact, you can actually do this mission fairly quickly due to the fact that Terran has the ability to cloak, and is extremely durable. However, with that being said, our mission is fairly different. It's a pretty simple build-up, destroy pretty much the entirety of the enemy bases, and then move Terran in eventually. Overall, though, it is a fairly simple strategy that works really well. Taking the 2 bases that are close to us, building up a defense force, then utilizing Zerglings, Hydralisks, Ultralisks, and Defilers, which this is the first time that the book has even mentioned Defilers, and utilizing them because they are insane. That being said, I'm terrible with Defilers, so who cares? And from there, pushing through to each of the different beacons. Also, the book tells us to utilize Nidus canals to get around more effectively, which I found to be pretty interesting. Overall, though, it is a pretty effective strategy that does work fairly well, and once Terran hits all of the different beacons, we can then watch Talametros blow up. Mission 8, to slay the beast, is the reason we even went to Talametros. We need to destroy the Overmind, and there's only one group of individuals who even have the capability of hurting the Overmind, the Dark Templar. Yeah, it turns out blowing up their hometown made them want to actually come and help us. This game's weird. Anyway, moving on. This mission has a pretty interesting strategy, utilizing Ultralisks and Hydralisks as our main fighting force to push through the enemy bases. And given the fact that this mission is probably the hardest mission in all of Starcraft, it is actually a fairly interesting mission. We get attacked often and aggressively with pretty much every force in the game, utilizing very powerful combinations of enemy forces, such as Ultralisks, Hydralisks, Valkyries, Battlecruisers, and everything else in between from both Zerg and Terran. However, with that being said, the strategy is really effective, mostly focusing on pushing out aggressively while utilizing the static defense that you have at home to protect your base. And overall, being able to push out as effectively and aggressively as we do, we can establish a very easy foothold. Once we've established our own island's foothold and don't have any other bases on it for our enemy to attack from, we can then push out to the second island and establish a base which is pretty sparsely defended. defended. From that position, we then have the ability to actually push through to the enemy base, taking out the main established forces under the Overmind, and then pushing through to the Overmind. I did not forget to bring the Dark Templar over. That is a lie. Who would tell you that? The game does obviously tell you to bring over the Dark Templar to utilize them for the Overmind's KO. However, I just forgot. Oops. The book does give us a very interesting strategy utilizing the Queens. Quote, when you go after the Overmind in Area B, first bring in your queens and use Spawn Broodling on many of the tanks, Ultralisks, and Defilers as you can. This will make the assault much easier. Unquote. And while overall it did end up working and weakening the enemy forces, it wasn't exactly easy to do. Taking a whole bunch of queens and making sure you hit high priority targets is a lot of effort, but it is really rewarding. So overall, pretty solid strategy. Mission 9, The Reckoning, took me several tries to actually get right. And the reason for this is because I didn't actually execute the strategy presented in the book correctly. The actual strategy did work really well. When I was finally able to actually follow the guide provided, I did end up winning the mission. And overall, it did work. It starts out by telling us to move quickly in order to establish a second base on this hill by taking it from the Terran. Originally, I thought this was a bad idea to attack so aggressively into the Terran, but actually you can do this pretty easily. Utilizing the Ultralisks as well as the Hydralisks and Guardians that you already have, you can pretty effectively push into the Terran, take a base, and by the 5-minute mark, have another mining base. This is mostly important for the gas. Gas will become very important later on because our main strategy is to build Ultralisks, Guardians, and Hydralisks, all of which do cost a fair amount of gas. However, utilizing the strange strategy, at least to me, of making 5 Ultralisks, 5 Guardians, and 48 Hydralisks to then push into the enemy base, we did end up actually accomplishing it. Again, it did take me a few tries, but overall, when I did actually make the necessary number of forces, I did end up pushing through. The Ultralisks were basically used to tank for Reaver shots and Psystorms. The Hydralisks were then the damage dealers, and the Guardians were basically just there for moral support. Overall, I don't really think I needed them, but hey, they weren't terrible. Now, one of the weird things about this is that it tells us to, quote, make sure you get all your Hydralisk, Ultralisk, air units, and Overlord upgrades, unquote, which is kind of one of the reasons that I ended up failing a few times, because I was focusing on making sure that I actually got all of my Overlord upgrades, and they're not actually necessary. I just slowed them down and inevitably got them, but didn't get them first. And eventually I was able to win the mission. Now, because I followed the guide so well and finished the mission with 7 minutes to spare, or more specifically, more than 5, I unlocked the secret mission, Dark Origin. This is a no-build mission where we take Zeratul and a bunch of Dark Archons around a map full of Terran protectors and steal all of their mines to utilize for our own nefarious schemes, or more specifically to find out the nefarious schemes of Duran. The mission overall is fairly simple, and the strategy again is also fairly simple. The only thing that I was unable of doing was capturing some medics. I don't know where these medics are. I saw a medic for like half of a frame at one point. I don't even know where it went. It just disappeared. I don't know. That being said, the rest of the strategy is fairly simple, taking battlecruisers, siege tanks, science vessels, and wraiths, and then just sweeping through the rest of the enemy forces as best as you can, utilizing Zeratul and some of the other forces to make sure that you can deal as much damage as possible. Quote, mind control is your best friend in this mission. In fact, the folks at Blizzard have done a great job of making this mission where you can mind control all kinds of enemy units, so use the mind control ability liberally. Unquote. Which, yeah, basically sums up this mission. Pretty cool mission. And on to the finale. Mission 10, Omega. This mission is the culmination of everything that we've done up until this point, and it's not even the hardest mission in the game. Yeah, that was 2 missions ago. This one is just too easy simply due to the fact that you have so much space to work with. While yes, there are 3 different enemy forces attacking you at any given time, your base is incredibly secure, it's incredibly easy to establish additional bases, and overall, the enemy forces are not all that intimidating. While some of them can be defensively, offensively, none of them really are that menacing. Well, most of them aren't. The UED is at least something. That being said, the book actually gives us 3 distinct strategies for each of the different enemies. For Mengsk, it tells us to utilize a solid air force, utilizing Mutalisks, Devourers, and Guardians to sweep through his base because most of his forces are ground reliant, or more specifically, rely on devastating ground forces. Siege tanks, nukes, etc. are very solid against enemy ground forces. For the UED, it tells us basically the opposite, to utilize Defilers, Ultralisks, Hydralisks, and Zerglings in order to sweep through the very air-centric UED faction. And then the Protoss are the Protoss. Let's be honest, the Protoss haven't been a challenge the entire campaign, and they're not really going to change anytime soon. So, yeah, they just kind of say, watch out for the Protoss, ooh. Anyway, we just kind of sweep through the Protoss with just whatever we have left, kind of moving everything in, and eventually everything dies. Overall, this mission is extremely fun, and the strategy given to us is also extremely well done. Utilizing different strategies for each individual enemy was very well thought out, and truly showcases how well they paid attention to not just the enemies, but the actual developers, showcasing how well that the enemies were put together. How the difference in Mengsk and the UED is for each of the Terran factions, how Artanis and the Protoss work now that they don't have access to all of the High Templar that they previously had, and now that they have access to Dark Templar, utilizing mind control and the Corsairs and stuff like that. It's a very fun mission, showcasing all of the power of all of the different factions, and it really is just the culmination of everything I love about Brood War. And that's it. The overall strategies presented in this book seemed to work really well. While some of them were more frustrating, and overall I did end up having to reset more times in this book than I did in the previous book, it did overall have some really solid strategies. And a lot of these strategies seemed to be more enhanced than in previous editions. So yeah, I really do think that this book was very useful, and it did help me in particular come up with a bunch of strategies when I was younger, or more inexperienced. And that's pretty much it. I don't really have anything else to say. This is a phenomenal book, and it held up really well even in modern era. And overall, the strategies were actually quite surprising in how well they were executed. So that's gonna be it. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope that you guys did indeed enjoy. If you did, a like is very much appreciated, and remember to always stay frosty. Bye-bye.